As I was working on this speech last week, the news came in that by a large majority, the members of the European Parliament had voted to have the so-called right to abortion placed in the European Union's Charter of Fundamental Rights. A prophet, Monsignor Ronald Knox once wrote, "A prophet sees the evils of the day with a clear eye. To call the right to murder our unborn a fundamental right is evil, and any country or continent that enshrines such a right will not survive. God is a God of mercy, but also a God of justice. Shame on the members who voted for this. There will be a reckoning." Faith and family in crisis, our panel is called. Who can deny it? Perhaps the willfully blind, the ignorant, or those who both wish for the crisis and are actively encouraging it. I don't intend to give an endless list of examples of what's been happening over the last 100 years or so to cause this crisis, which is accelerating rapidly. I'm sure most of you are obviously aware of it. It's been alluded to and will be alluded to by other speakers. If I address certain issues, we can only touch on some in a short speech. It's a challenge those of us who call ourselves conservatives, but most especially the Christians and believers amongst us, to fight the good fight with all our might. It's also getting more difficult to attempt to give a positive vision for us to work on and to not be drowned in the slough of despond and discouragement. We know in the Bible that apart from being a moment of destruction or calamity, the word crisis can also mean a moment of opportunity. Etymologically, the word comes from the Greek root meaning the turning point in a disease. It can either get much worse or much better. Later it developed, as we know, into the word for a moment of decision. The patients, the sick patients, both faith and family, are very sick. And of course, they're inseparable in their sickness. When the faith is sick, inevitably the family suffers and vice versa. Interwoven as they are, let us first glance at the sick patient called the family, examine some of the signs of the condition it's suffering, and propose some life-saving medication that will bring the patient out of this moment of crisis. We must, of course, in all these proposals, have the true conservative virtue of humility, acknowledging that time, when properly managed, can truly be the great healer. A conservative and a Catholic knows that nothing good happens quickly, especially when rebuilding a virtually destroyed Christian culture. I often think when surveying the West of what St. Augustine must have felt sitting in his diocese in Hippo in present-day Algeria, seeing the barbarians destroying all that appeared civilized. In a less elevated vision, I remember the scene in The Planet of the Apes, the good old Charlton Heston one, not the modern one, where right at the end, if you remember, the ruins of 20th century America appear buried under the sand, and Heston almost despairs. Friends, we're in some way both St. Augustine and Charlton Heston. We have work to be done in faith and hope. Chesterton, not Charlton Heston, Gilbert Chesterton, the apostle of common sense and a worthy patron for all our endeavors, called the family the one anarchist institution. Anarchism at NatCon. We didn't think we'd get that. The one anarchist institution. He said it's anarchist because it is older than the law and stands outside the state. The family, as those of us who believe in it, in its divine origin, know comes from the direct work of God's creation. Male and female, he created them, created in his image. All that violates the family, the law, the state, culture, ultimately violates both the will of God and the intrinsic, perhaps not infinite, dignity of the human person, made in God's image, redeemed, and given even greater dignity in the person of Jesus Christ. Again, Chesterton said, the truth is that only men to whom the family is sacred will ever have a standard or a status by which to criticize the state. That's very important. It's our first positive proposal or reproposal. The family is sacred. Without listing all the ways we know the patient known as the family is in crisis, it is first and foremost from those who don't believe in its divine origin, who therefore do not see it as sacred, and who are determined to manipulate it for either naive but false altruistic means or for far darker means. The totalitarian state, and perhaps the modern state in general, is not satisfied with passive obedience. It demands full cooperation from the cradle to the grave. Not my words, but the words of the great Catholic historian Christopher Dawson, written many years ago. How prescient, how prophetic. He had, of course, the horrors of Nazism and communism in mind, but he was indeed prescient in saying, when he spoke of the modern state in general, we know the increasing influence of the state over every area of family life, from cradle to grave. Not that there's no place for the law or the state, but it must be severely limited and the present overreach be reversed. If individuals have any hope of protecting their freedom, they must protect their family life. The wisdom of Gilbert again. We conservatives, and I need to remind you, I'm not talking about parties called conservatives, as in my own country, they've lost all right to use that title. Conservatives and Orthodox Christians must be at the forefront to defend what is strangely called the traditional family. There is a place for the state, governmental support for marriage and children, for example, as is so beautifully being practiced in the great nation of Hungary. The definition of what marriage is. There must be a vigorous defense of the sacredness of the family, and the spirit of defeat has to be resisted. This leads into the second area where we can fight back, defend the family, and resist the forces determined to create something very different. Once again, Dawson wrote something so profound, so true, and so obvious, yet often neglected by the church and those who claim to defend the family. Universal secular education is an infallible instrument for the secularization of culture. The communists knew this. Anyone with a brain knows this. We see the evidence of this all around us. It is a sign of the sickness of the patient. It is the deliberate, intentional, and it's very successful. Christian classical education is the antidote. And huge resources, especially from the church, but also from concerned citizens, must be directed to this cause. Parents have the right to educate their children. Parents have the right to resist the indoctrination of their children. Parents, even with state support, have the right to send their children to schools of their choice. And, very importantly in Europe, parents have the right to homeschool their children. Closely linked with education, but also part of the intersection of the crisis of both family and faith, is culture. We know the etymology of the word culture. Dawson writes that the challenge of secularism must be met at the cultural level, if it is to be met at all. Otherwise, Christians will be pushed not only out of modern culture, but out of physical existence. Welcome to the West. Here I challenge the church, addressing the crisis of faith in a very particular way. All my criticism, by the way, has to be a little bit circumspect and restrained as a priest. These are days when even constructive criticism can bring down clerical cancellation. Big Brother is always watching. Dawson writes, now the Christian world of the past was exceptionally well provided with ways of access to spiritual realities. Christian culture was essentially a sacramental culture, which embodied religious truth in visible and palpable forms. Art and architecture, music and poetry and drama, philosophy and history were all used as channels for the communication of religious truth. Today, these channels have been closed by unbelief or choked by ignorance. Obviously, this is primarily and principally the work of the laity, but the encouragement and commitment of the clerical caste, and particularly the hierarchy, is essential. The redemption or the recapturing of culture is the work of beauty, truth, and goodness. This is not dilettantism or aestheticism. It's part of the cure for the crisis of faith and family. I managed to get through 6 years in the seminary without one course on art or music, architecture, or indeed culture. I suffered 2 semesters on Gaudium et Spes, a torture worse than being flayed alive with a blunt knife. We need clerics who care more about Gaudi than golf, and who firmly believe and promote beauty in all its forms in the church. Dawson says that because the culture is now post-Christian, we have a double task: to recover our own cultural inheritance and to communicate it to a sub-religious or neo-pagan world. That recovery is most certainly part of the work of the institutional church. It's positive, it's exciting, and it must be of critical importance. Similarly, the communication of that classic Christian culture is the work of the church. One of the reasons why St. John Paul wrote his beautiful letter to artists. It is, as I said, principally the work of the laity, supported by the church. It is being done, and I have to say, much better in the United States than in Europe. It costs money. We can't penny pinch with the restoration of Christian culture. I was just in Florida visiting a parish that just built a beautiful and, yes, very expensive church. Beauty is a far better evangelical tool than PowerPoint or parish programs. Dawson says the second task, communicating this to our restored cultural inheritance, is not as difficult as we think, because, he says, people are becoming more and more aware that something is lacking in their culture. This echoes the words of Walker Percy, who said at some point young people would be so sick of the culture around them, they would come to the church. We better have something for them, and part of the crisis of the faith is the failure to see in the liturgy, both ancient and modern, beauty must captivate before it converts. Benedict XVI wrote that Christians must not be too easily satisfied. They must make the church into a place where beauty and hence truth is at home. Without this, the world will become the first circle of hell. To the extent that beauty and hence truth is not at home in the church, the faith is in crisis. The final area where the sickness of faith and family coalesce, and where perhaps the crisis, the moment of recovery or destruction, is most acute, the very meaning of what it means to be human. 6 years ago, in a book review in First Things magazine, the Cambridge theologian Richard Rex gave us the perfect reason why this panel is discussing this issue today. Rex said correctly that in the life of the church, Christianity, there have been 3 crises, the very word we've been exploring, moments that could have gone very badly. The first crisis, dealt with over a couple of centuries, was the question of what is God? Who is God? Answered by the ecumenical councils Nicaea, Chalcedon. The second crisis, brought on by the catastrophe otherwise known as the Reformation, was the question, what is the church? Rex wrote that we are now living in the third great crisis of the life of Christianity. What is man? This, sadly but appropriately for our discussion, is not a crisis we can afford to wait centuries to cure. The survival of the human race depends upon it. Benedict XVI wrote that the modern state in the West, with its radical manipulation of man and distortion of the sexes through gender ideology, opposes Christianity in a very particular way. I'm going to cut a little bit because I know, running out of time. Friends, this is the crisis of faith and family. It's extremely serious. Benedict says that modernity, which is independent of the truth, makes man his own creator and disputes the original gift of creation, and manifests a will to recreate the world contrary to the truth. This will, he says, necessarily lead to intolerance. That's a rather gentle way of putting it. It will and has already led to cancellation, the loss of employment, imprisonment, and perhaps on the horizon worse. Christians who uphold the basic doctrine of human creation, the distinction of the sexes, the right to life from conception until natural death, are already the equivalent of dhimmis in the Muslim world. Rex calls them subaltern groups, who he says learn their position in society. How many Christian doctors, nurses, teachers are now in those subaltern groups? Know your place, go with the flow, don't speak, and above all, do not bring your faith into the public square. The church must be robust in defense of God's plan for humanity. This is a demonic oppression, and we have to speak out. Last but not least, in this time of confusion, Michael O'Brien wrote many years ago, we need clarity from the church. Despite the recent document, which the Babylon Bee amusingly headlined, Breaking News, the church teaches Catholic doctrine. This crisis needs robust, vigorous, joyful preaching and teaching. This is a message of hope for a lonely world. The church that marries the spirit of the age, as Deaning said, will be a widow in the next. But also the church must not flirt with the spirit of the age. It mustn't engage in a dalliance with the spirit of the age, or the church will be cuckolded. The spirit will not be faithful. Lastly, before he died, not long before he died, Pope Benedict wrote something extraordinary. If you remember nothing else of what I said, listen to what Pope Benedict said not long before he died. He looked at the story of the book of Maccabees, the story in the Old Testament of the Maccabees, those faithful Jews who refused to deny their identity and their fidelity to the God of their ancestors. Benedict points to the figure of Mattathias, who preferred to die rather than obey falsehood. Benedict writes, these are his stunning words, Pope Benedict's writing, the attitude of Mattathias, who said, we will not obey the king's words, is that of Christians. In brackets he put, by what Mattathias meant, not obeying the king's words. Pope Benedict wrote, modern legislation. The attitude of Mattathias, we will not obey the king's words, modern legislation, which denies God's truth, is that of Christians. We're in apostolic times now. The faith and faithful families changed the culture. They created Christian civilization. The faith, witnessed by fervent preaching and living, told men and women, the poor, the downtrodden, prostitutes, slaves, they were sons and daughters of God. Families lived that faith, changed a culture of death to a culture of life. They were a creative minority, but they were creative. God, wrote Cardinal Muller, is the origin and goal of human beings. He himself is the goal of our infinite quest for truth and happiness. Forgetting God, we miss our true being. Preaching and living that makes this crisis a moment of opportunity.